Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Wonderful to see a packed post-lunch crowd, so I appreciate it. I'm Mark Wilson. I'm Global Design Editor at Fast Company. Today we're talking about rebranding at scale. So much of what Canva does, and I'm sure the way a lot of people here use Canva is really about like literally scaling brands, right? Across all sorts of mediums. And we have a collection of people working within brand today. They're all phenomenal. I'm just going to briefly introduce them. On my far end, we have Joe from Accept and Proceed. Accept and Proceed is interesting because they really work at digital and physical experience for brands like Nike, BMW, NASA, and so a really nice sort of expansive view there. We have Lee with JKR. JKR, you would know by brands like Burger King, Impossible, just your quintessential sort of global brand system company in a lot of ways. And then we have Talia with her own firm Cotton. Talia really works at the forefront of designing through code, and her work really reflects that. Talia couldn't have made what she makes probably 20 years ago, or at least not as quickly. That's probably another point of discussion. So anyway, we're just going to walk through branding and sort of address a lot of the, I think, topics we're all curious about. I will say I've written about design for about 15 years now, and branding is the thing that the audience is most passionate about. Like, you can write about urban design, you can write about social justice, you can write about hospital design, but branding is what everybody really gets up in arms about. So let's get into it. How do I know if I'm ready for a rebrand? My company is.
Do you want me to take that one?
Whoever would like to.
I guess it sounds quite sort of simple, but the most important trigger is a business objective that demands branding to be the answer. And by that I mean, a change in market or a change in audience or a change in positioning that needs a perception shift. So, for example, you mentioned Impossible. The idea that you want to open up the market to be addressing meat eaters as opposed to flexitarians shifts the fundamental of the way that brand shows up. Has to be attractive to a new audience, has to feel like it can compete with meat as opposed to being a quality plant-based alternative. So those kind of things are the kind of, you need to know that there's a change to be made. It's going to make a material difference to the business. That's, in our view.
So it's a point of inflection. Sorry.
And I think in a way that that works off of what you were saying, why people are so excited about branding, because branding really is an identity. It's something that we relate to. It's something that we as people can connect with. And as soon as there's sort of like Lee was saying, kind of that difference in perception from where a brand wants to be versus how people are seeing that brand, that is that point where people are suddenly like, okay, now we need to rebrand this thing and change that public perception of what that brand is.
Do you need to be an inflection point? Like, what if my brand just sucks? Right?
That is an inflection point, exactly, right? Yeah, if your brand just sucks, you probably know it because you perceive it. There is a tension. Why do you know your brand sucks? It's probably because you've heard, you've seen it not perform, you've seen customers. There's a tension there, and those are the red flags, or the orange flags for that matter, that will, trigger a branding project.
There's a funny reference that brings to mind. If anyone has ever seen kind of like those 90s high school movies where someone goes through like a makeover because they're like the weird girl that like nobody likes, and then suddenly they go through a makeover, and by the end they realize like, oh, I'm not the cool popular girl either, I'm kind of like somewhere in the middle. They needed that rebrand because they were like, no one liked them for being what they were. But at the very
end, it's really tough for people with glasses everywhere, by the way.
I didn't say glasses, you did. But the idea is that they discover their true identity in doing that process. It's the rebrand is necessary because there's an inflection point, people don't like it, something like that. And then over time you discover what your true identity is in branding terms, colors, typographies, logos, things like that. And then that makes a good rebrand.
It's an interesting point you make, and it reminds me of what Bob Iger said this morning about the enduring values of brands and how few have stood the test of time. So it's a question around if it sucks, it's often because it's lost its way. It's gone off the path of what it should be, lost sense of its own self. And so a lot of the work we do is to try and bring brands back to the best version of themselves, to avoid that kind of where you may have been taken down a path of genericisms, or you may well have, taken on some of the codes of the kind of early sort of era of Mac design that a lot of CPG brands had to kind of cleanse themselves of. So sometimes it is almost a therapy session of getting back to yourself at a brand level.
I also think this might not be the bestest of ideas, but I also think that some brands need to die. Some brands, this is awful. It's sounding wrong.
No. Let's roll with this.
Time, I think that, brands all have a life cycle, and some need to sunset, and that's okay too. The problem sometimes is when those brands that are on their way down still want to stay within the dominant structure and stay relevant. And that's a real opportunity for them to actually be relevant and perhaps go back to what initially, made them successful. Or
let me clarify something really fast. When you say some brands need to die, you mean the brand, not the company. Are you distinguishing those two ideas really when you make that point?
I'm not, no. Oh no, I've become that person in the panel. We have seen companies that don't exist anymore, and companies that Blockbuster for that matter, companies that I care deeply about on a Friday evening when growing up, and they don't exist anymore. And as much as it pains me for Blockbuster, that's okay. And I think that there is also an acknowledgement that a brand, a company, a business has a life cycle.
I think that's a totally fair idea, right? Like companies, I don't know. They are human-created structures built upon capitalism. It's okay. Like they'll be okay usually.
I think before you go to the ultimate question is, would a rebrand have saved Blockbuster and all the other companies that died?
Whoa, would a rebrand have saved Blockbuster? Do you want to dig in right now?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I want to dig into this. Would a rebrand have saved Blockbuster? I don't know who ran Blockbuster, so I'm going to be Mr. Blockbuster. I'm coming to the three of you. Obviously, I'm running a retail location where we rent out movies. Netflix has been kicking our butt. So what do I do? Do I need a new logo?
I mean, I think it's a good point that if the fundamental offer of the business is irrelevant, which essentially what happened to Blockbuster, the branding isn't going to save it, to your point. And you may love that, and you may have real nostalgic affection and genuine love for that brand, but the proposition just couldn't survive. And I think that's, an honesty that often is missing, that there's a perception that just branding will save a flawed proposition. And I think, again, to the point earlier, it needs to be in service of a business shift that is proved by either the experience or the evidence that the brand puts out in the world, I believe.
Well, I mean, this kind of leads me to a second point I wanted to unpack, which was, if I'm a business and I'm going to approach one of you because I feel like it's time for a rebrand, like what is my homework? Because it does sound like there's a level of preparation I'm supposed to do first.
You mean, what is your homework for entering a rebrand journey?
Exactly. I'm entering the rebrand journey.
I think generally most branding agencies will guide you through that homework. They will assign that homework for you, but you don't have to come into it necessarily with anything. But a lot of that homework is going to be research and conversation and getting to know the people behind the brand and getting to know new goals and getting to know the new target audiences and getting to know the applications of where people will now be encountering the brand, where they have been, what the history of the brand has been, pretty much everything that makes the identity minus the visuals, and that's where the branding comes in.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll reference Burger King as an example because you mentioned it earlier. The homework the business did was to, commit to no preservatives, no artificial flavorings as a product and as an offer. And then it puts everything we did into context, because you have to acknowledge that it probably couldn't justify that proposition with the existing branding. So, that homework was done by the business, the commitments they made, and then our job was to try and essentially bring a brand to the world that was as craveable as the tasty, authentic foods that the business had committed to. So I think that the homework has got to be in the acts that you commit to justify the shift in perception or the shift into the market.
Right, creating the inflection point is essentially the homework, it sounds like.
Yeah, and being committed to a change of, of acts and actual proposition.
If there is one bit of homework that a company should come to a branding agency with, it is, why do you want a rebrand right now? Sometimes it's arbitrary, but most often it's, again, going back to the first question, a shift in perception or goals.
Going back to what you just said, Lee, I feel like the best quality for rebranding that a client can come with is bravery, because it does require a lot of discussions, tensions. Even if it's a big company, the verticals that don't talk to each other, it's almost like a big therapy session that you are asking outsiders, typically, a branding company, to help you guide on that. And that's not easy. It's a roller coaster of a journey. And I think, being brave, showing up and being brave would be the homework I would give a client.
And it's interesting to think of bravery and also the consequence of the question you're asking, especially in the environment we're in today, that to understand where the change is going to take place and how equipped you are and ready you are for the cultural change of a rebrand, and that you understand the users and what they're going to need, and have we got the technology, have we got the tools to change, I think is making sure that both the agency and the client understand what we're signing up to, and we can map that out and plan it as well.
I think everybody here creates complete brand systems, right? Which can be incredibly encompassing, from your logo to your entire graphic design treatment. Every big company is creating its own typefaces, so it can literally speak in its own language, essentially. But I am curious, how important is the logo to you? Because it does, I will say, when I look at the conversation around a rebrand, 95% is focused on the logo. When I look at the effort of a rebrand, I can't speak to the efforts you're putting in, but it's often, a sliver of the sort of the greater work that goes into it.
I love this question, especially, I think it's a very future-focused question, because if you asked that question even 10 years ago, the logo was the brand, and that's the history of branding. I think the answer goes back to, I think the logo is important, but it goes back to, where are people engaging with your brand? If it is mostly in places where you need a logo to represent the brand, then the logo is the most important thing. But what we're also seeing is, on the flip side, we're seeing that, websites are sometimes, the colors, the experience, the whole visual that goes along with the logo is sometimes even more important than the logo now, because that starts to sort of become the thing that represents the brand, that image that people see in their heads, the very first thing that people see when they engage with the brand. And sometimes the logo, the name of the company, is just the URL, and that's okay, because everything else sort of speaks the brand. So again, what it comes down to is, where are people engaging with your brand, and how do you make sure that the places where they're engaging with your brand are encapsulate the identity as best as possible?
I also think it's not a binary answer of whether it's important or not, because there's smaller companies that are trying to, get out there, get a new name and get a new logo, and that's a very different ask to companies that are already established, that already have, that their name already have a kind of strong emotion on, or even known on people. So the logo or not, it's usually what branding comes down to still. I think that's what my parents still think I do. But It really is. It's not binary. There's a whole flex of things to solve within the branding, and logo can be part of it, when you can also do an entire global rebrand and not touch the logo at all. So
Yeah, I guess the logo's job by definition is to be a symbol of meaning. So it kind of exists as that. So, but you can also imbue meaning by not touching the logo. You know, we rebranded Uber and didn't touch the logo to move it from a ride-hail app to a mobility business. And that was all system, because that was required to encapsulate a bigger audience, a bigger proposition from the business. So you can change everything by changing nothing in some instances. Tiffany's a great example. Our perception of what Tiffany's is as a business and as a brand is profoundly different than it was 2 years ago. And they've touched nothing, but they've changed their role in culture. They've changed their role in people's lives and the commercial proposition behind it by changing a lot of things around. So yeah, I think, and of course, the symbol of change is the logo. So people get fixated on it, but it doesn't have to change quite a lot about what the brand stands for.
Something I'm sure we've all noticed over the last decade is that design has gotten a lot better across the board. All right, Talia wants to push back on that idea, which we can over drinks after this. But I would say the base level for design of most products, of most websites, of most print materials is higher than it was a decade or longer ago. And I do think, you know, being here at an event for Canva, we do see how tools are sort of raising that baseline. My question is, how do you make a brand stand out at a time when everything is pretty good? And I would also say, I do think a lot of what brand agencies did for a while was to give sort of a nice polish to what could otherwise be a, you know, ugly company.
I was going to take that question first with the logo question, because there's also the humor in designers of the trend of going back to sans serifs, or then the trend of, going back to serifs, or doing it black and white, or those trends of it has to be, you know, small enough for it to be an avatar on your Instagram profile. And in a way, some people call this blandification or enshittification of brands, because they're almost reduced to a symbol or following trends and technology.
How many tech companies do we need writing in like variations of Helvetica, more or less, right?
Yes, I don't know the answer to that question. But I think you're right. The standard of design it's pretty incredible, and standing out is harder. And we were talking a little bit about this before, but it really comes back to the essence of the company. What does the company stand for? And you mentioned the whole capitalistic thing, and I truly believe that a company should stand for more than just the bottom line for shareholders. And I think more and more so we're aligning ourselves, or brands are aligning ourselves to something greater. I feel the truth in that, really, in what we see today, only those brands will survive. And the authenticity of that relationship, I think it's what will truly set some apart.
There's something interesting about the way you phrase that question. Yeah, go ahead. Yes. The question.
I feel like you're just like about to drop a gauntlet on me. Like there's just something about like a wind up. Anyway, go for it.
I do think it's worth pointing out that your question was, how do you make a brand stand out? And sometimes it's okay if a brand doesn't stand out. Sometimes the goal of the brand is not to stand out. Sometimes the goal of the brand is to appear like something that people can relate to. But if the goal of the brand is to stand out, I totally second what Joe was saying. I think that with every brand, every single brand minus the visual is unique, because they're unique by the people behind it, the goals behind it, the product behind it, the size, the location, the working hours, the dynamic, every single thing. And if the visual, the brand identity, can reflect that in some capacity, that does sound pretty easy in sort of making it stand out, because it's based on the true identity versus something that sort of we've seen. I think it also it sort of puts a bit of a responsibility on creatives nowadays, because we're all sort of collectively trying to push creative innovation, and it's a responsibility. It's exploring new tools. It's turning off things that we see in the world so that we can come up with our own original ideas without being biased by what we do see out there. But I don't think it's hopeless. I think it's actually very exciting and possible. In the way that we've come this far in design, I think we can continue to push creative innovation.
I do want to really quickly follow up on the standout idea, because I do think it's interesting and rich and worth pulling string on, which is that perhaps standout's a bad phrasing, but how would you feel about distinctive? Does your brand need to be distinctive? Or is that not really a prerequisite to a brand? Because I would assume 100% that it would need to be distinctive.
It's a good question. Yeah. Yeah, I think so, because why would you go to your competition? Because we are distinct for X and Y reason.
And I think that touches on the previous question as well, which I think we are probably in a golden era of design. I don't think you've ever seen the quality and the consistency of design and the application of it to the degree we've seen it now, driven by screens. So I've got 3 teenage daughters that are all smartphone era children. They learn the operating system before they learn to read or write. So screens have meant that we are born design literate. Commerce is everywhere. So we have to be able to design an experience that can get people to buy immediately. And the democratization of technology has meant that the ability to design is being opened up. So it's incredible. But at the other side of that argument, we studied, one of the biggest studies of distinctive assets ever done last year. We did a report with Ipsos, and only 15% of branded assets are truly distinctive. So in the rise of the standard and quality of design, you have to elevate even more, because everything looks great, everything works, everything is seamless. How do you ensure that you always know which brand you're in the presence of? I think is a fundamental challenge in such a high standard of design generally. So yes, you have to be distinctive, is my view.
No. Thinking face is great. Another thread I want to pull on is related to distinctiveness, and I think a lot about sort of, the work for Nike that you've done. I think a lot about sort of the logos and brand identities you're creating in code. These are experiences that don't scale to a current platform like a Canva, right? Like Canva allows you to sort of copy and paste brand very rapidly in this really incredible way. But it does feel like a lot of the next generation of design is sort of, I don't see it being able to be sort of clone stampable across brand assets in the same way. So I'm curious about how you're thinking about that.
I don't know, part of me says that a lot of the global brands have almost become too big. And the beauty of Nike from its very inception was the fact that they had a really good temperature on culture. And tapping into that is only achievable through having a really strong connection with small communities, right? When you become a brand at the scale of Nike and so many others, there's a tendency to distance yourself from that, and with that, perhaps distance yourself from the very same thing that made you very successful. I feel like tools like Canva help, whether that's in-house or help the democratization of design for companies perhaps that don't have an in-house design team, even the ability for in-house design teams to adopt that. I don't know, I feel like there is a level that we need. The way I'm thinking about things is that we need to probably start reframing things and making them more local. And I love that idea of design going back to something more tangible, something more approachable. When I refer to communities, I don't want to talk about communities as the community of the brand is the customer of the brand. I want to talk about communities, the communities that are impacted by the space around me, my neighborhood. The whole term of, again, community has been jargonized and co-opted by marketing and then become this new word. Sorry, I'm ranting. I just feel that there might be the optimistic in me that wants to see global brands start talking at a much smaller scale. And I feel like Canva and many other tools in technology could allow that.
That question is very strong in our practice. Part of what we do is we make custom design tools using code for brands to sort of like integrate their new assets that aren't as easy to make using other design tools. And something on that is that a lot of the way people think about creativity is that creativity evolves based on new developments in technology. That's the common conversation. Technology evolves, and then we can do more things with creativity. The way we think about it, which I think applies to your question, is kind of the inverse in that as soon as we make new things, new visuals, new things that are difficult to make using the current tools that we have, the people making the tools, the developers, the product designers, everything like that, will see that, and they will need to respond to it by making those tools a little bit easier for the average designer, the people, to make these visuals that we don't commonly see.
So you lead with the art, in other words.
Lead with the art, and then the tool will follow. And I'm confident, especially after this morning's keynote, that Canva is totally thinking along those lines. They're seeing what the creative world around us is doing and responding to that by improving the tools every single day. So I really do think lead with the creative, and then the tool will follow. Push those boundaries, and that's how you make the design that hasn't been seen before and the brands that sort of stand out or are distinguished.
There's an interesting point that seems to join those two up about that thought of the intimacy of kind of groups and communities that big brands need to be able to tap into and have a two-way kind of relationship with, and being able to use the new tools to give a degree of fixed kind of, I guess, discipline for how the brand shows up, but allow people to play with them and be a bit more fluid and a bit more flexed in the way that you can personalize, localize, interpret them. And that's what I think is really exciting, is we've never been able to do that because it was either chaos or absolute conformity. And I think this is a really exciting time where branding can actually be the device that lets you feel closer to these big scale brands, as opposed to communicating or advertising to them. You feel like the pull comes from the ability for branding to give that intimacy, which I think is really, really quite exciting. And you could never have done it without tools we've got at our disposal today.
We just have a couple minutes left, so we do have to wrap. But for our last question, I am curious. Obviously, AI is a huge topic. It's been a huge topic of Canva Create. And I'm curious, what's an unexpected way you think AI is going to impact branding?
Raise the standard even more.
Yeah, so like basically the baseline, kind of like the baseline of design, I think it's been raising. It'll help.
It's just the story of innovation. The more we innovate, the more we try to outdo what we've already done. AI is innovation, and it's just going to make the things that we've been doing a lot easier so that we can do even better.
I think it depends on how we use it. Make everything look more the same, or train it to be truly distinctive to a brand. I think it's all down to how we apply it.
Yeah, I'm very excited with how we're using it currently. I think we're only at the tip of the iceberg of what we're doing. It also is having really hard conversations of where we're getting this data from, how are we, all the conversations of where that conversations are happening in artificial intelligence elsewhere are also coming into the design of how are we using it and the ethics around that. So even it used as a tool and it used as hard conversations about ourselves, I absolutely love that.
Well, thank you. This is a great chat. I feel like if I had some conclusions, it would be like communities mandatory, logos optional, AI question mark seems okay. Thank you so much, Joe,
Mark.
Lee,
Thank
Kali.
you,
Appreciate
thank
it.
you.
Thank you, everybody.
Everyone.